Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. Welcome to the Kennedy School. Welcome to Harvard University. I'm Nick Burns. I'm a professor here, someone who worked for a long time in my diplomatic career on Russia. And tonight we're going to talk about the United States politics and the Russian Federation. Interesting title. I would start by saying, before I introduce my guests, that Russia is the greatest adversary, the strongest adversary, the most dangerous adversary that the United States faces in the world today. How could it be otherwise when Russia's contesting the peace of the end of the Cold War, the peace that we made for a unified Europe, by its invasion of Georgia in August 2008 and its dismemberment of Georgia, by its dismemberment of Moldova and the frozen conflict in the Transnistria, by Vladimir Putin's illegal annexation of Crimea in March 2014, violating the most basic red line in international law, by his continued division of eastern Ukraine, by his harassment of the Baltic states. That's number one. But number two, Putin's also leading in the dismemberment of Syria. And we saw that very dramatically and horrifically over the last 24 hours, when the Syrian government, Putin's ally, used sarin gas in a chemical weapons attack to kill innocent civilians in Idlib province. There have been repeated chemical weapons attacks, no denunciations by Russia, no actions by Russia to curb the Syrian Air Force, Russia and Iran in league with someone, Bashar al-Assad, who'll be convicted, we hope, of war crimes in the future. And finally, Russian interference in America's democracy. We're 100% sure, according to our intelligence agencies, that the Russian government interfered on behalf of one candidate against another candidate in our 2016 elections. There's an allegation, it has not been proven, that there may have been collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. There are allegations, I think quite well founded, that the Russian government tried to interfere in the Dutch elections last month, is interfering in the French elections this month, will interfere in the German campaign in September 24th. And so Russia represents an extraordinary threat to our country. And tonight we'll talk about the US-Russia relationship, but also talk about the threat that Russia poses to our democracy here at home. We have three outstanding guests, and I wanted to point first to Jill Doherty, who is with us from Seattle, Washington. Jill lives there. We usually see Jill on a big screen like this or a small screen, our television sets at home. Let me tell you something about Jill. She's an expert on Russia and the former Soviet Union. She worked as a journalist and foreign correspondent for CNN for 3 decades. I got to know Jill when she was the White House correspondent in the administrations of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton in Washington, D.C. That's where we became friends. I greatly admire her integrity as a journalist and her knowledge of Russia. She served as a correspondent in Russia for CNN for many years as Moscow bureau chief. She also served in Hong Kong and was Asia-Pacific correspondent for CNN. As I said, she served at the White House, and she served here at the Shorenstein Center as a fellow at Harvard University in 2013 and 14. So please join me in welcoming Jill Doherty from Seattle, Washington. Next, we're very, very pleased that Molly McHugh, seated just to my left, is here. Molly's a foreign policy and strategy consultant and an information warfare expert. She's an analyst and author. Her articles have appeared in the Washington Post, in Politico, many other print publications. She's been a frequent commentator on radio and television. She specializes in developing and deploying concise, effective narratives to counter targeted information attacks. Molly is the CEO of Fianna Strategies. It's a consulting firm in the government and advisory space. She is resident right now in Tallinn, in Estonia. She's been working with the Baltic states, with Georgia, with Moldova, and Ukraine to counter the massive disinformation campaigns, the fake news industry that the Russian government is running against the people of Eastern Europe. She hails from Idaho, and we're really glad that Molly is with us today. Last but definitely not least is my colleague and friend, Brigadier General Kevin Ryan. Kevin and I have been here together at Harvard for the last 8 years. Kevin is a retired U.S. Army general. He has been our Director of Defense and Intelligence Projects at the Belfer Center here at the Kennedy School. He's a career military officer. He served in missile defense and intelligence and in political military policy. From 1995 to 1996, he was head of the Moscow office of our effort, the POW MIA Commission, to find missing Americans in the former Soviet states. From 1998 to 2000, he served as Senior Regional Director for Slavic States in the Office of Secretary of Defense. He was the United States Defense Attaché at the American Embassy in Moscow from 2001 to 2005. He also served as Chief of Staff for the Army Space and Missile Defense Command. He has had brigade, platoon commands in Europe, in Iraq, and in Korea. In his last duty office, he was responsible for Army Strategic War Plans, policy, and international affairs. He has tremendous experience. He's one of our great Russia experts, so thank you, Kevin, for being with us. So our order of battle is that I'm going to ask Jill and Molly and Kevin a series of questions over the next 40 minutes or so. Then we'll stop our conversation and we'll turn to you. We have microphones, 2 in the floor, 2 in the first balcony. If you'd like to ask a question, once we've concluded our conversation, please line up behind the microphone. The only thing we ask is that you give us your name, what you're studying here at Harvard, or if you're not a Harvard student, what you're doing in life, and be sure that your question has a question mark attached to it. At the end, we'll try to take as many questions as we can. I want to have a conversation with Jill and Molly and Kevin about several subjects. Number 1, Russian interference in the US election. Number 2, how do you see the future of US-Russian relations? President Trump will have his first meeting with Vladimir Putin probably this summer on the margins of the G20 summit in Germany. We want to talk about the St. Petersburg terrorist attack of 2 days ago. Molly has written about that. We definitely want to talk about the sarin gas attacks in Idlib province and possible Russian complicity. So we have a lot to talk about. Let's get started. Jill, I want to ask you the first question since you're the furthest away and you are the one who's been engaged in Russian affairs for the longest of all of us. How serious a challenge to the United States and our democracy is this concerted, consistent Russian campaign to introduce fake news into our political system and possibly to distort the election through covert means? And welcome.
I think it's very, I will turn down the volume here since I'm hearing myself. I think it's very serious because one of the narratives one of the questions right now, the way the question is posed, is to say, well, they didn't physically get into our machines that control the election. Therefore, the votes that we cast were not interfered with. Therefore, it's not a big deal. But I think it is a big deal because it's more insidious. What they did, and this is, because now we have this maelstrom of information, news, fake news, etc., swirling around the world. And it is quite obvious that they made an attempt, and I think succeeded to a certain extent, in pushing narratives to either push an idea, break down another idea, damage, no question, damage Hillary Clinton. And because of damaging Hillary Clinton, there were only 2 candidates, you ultimately end up helping Donald Trump. We can get into that, I think, later. Did they deliberately set out to help him? Did it kind of morph into that? But I think the challenge is very serious because it not only begins to kind of undermine candidates, but it undermines faith in the system. There are a lot of Americans out there right now who really don't believe that the system is honest at all. And it's a lot easier to say a pox on all their houses and just give up in trying to understand the truth. The truth itself is under question. So I do think that it's a very serious thing, Nick.
Jill, you're a veteran of Washington politics. You were a White House correspondent for a long time, so you understand both foreign policy and domestic politics. Are you surprised that we haven't even arrived at a consensus that this great, dangerous adversary interfered in our elections and there should be an investigation? The House Intelligence Committee has broken down on partisan lines. Unclear whether the Senate Intelligence Committee can proceed. Some people believe there should be a bipartisan commission or even a special prosecutor. Are you surprised that we're arguing about this? Shouldn't we have a concerted investigation?
Well, I'm not, because it is not a straight-ahead question anymore. It has become highly politicized so that the people, let's say, on the side of Donald Trump tend to think, or at least say, that it's not a big deal. And the people on the other side tend to see, boogeymen under every bed. So it's become almost irrational. And I think it's very, very difficult to get to the truth. I think there should be some type of independent body, whether it's a special prosecutor, whatever, that takes it out of the political realm. I think it's very damaging to our system and to the belief of Americans. And oddly or ironically, this is precisely what Russian propaganda would love to see. All of this chaos. There's, when Russian propaganda, and again, Molly knows this so well, and you all know it, but part of it is a message to the world, part of it is a message to the United States, but a lot of it is a message to the Russian people as well. And the message, I think, can be defined as, look at the United States, look at their chaos. Would you want to live in that chaos? It's very dangerous. Look, their country is falling apart. We don't want to become like that, so don't do what they do. Don't have the robust debate. Don't do anything, just sit there. And that is even more dangerous.
Thank you. Molly, I want to turn to you and ask you a two-part question. The first is the same question I asked Jill, and I'll ask Kevin the same question. Do you think this is a serious threat to our democracy, that a foreign power, an aggressive foreign power, has interfered? And here's what David Ignatius said. Here's the second part. In his column in the Washington Post this morning, and he's a fellow at our Future Diplomacy Project, he writes for the Post, he said the Trump administration's mantra in response to the Russian attacks is admit nothing, deny everything, make counter accusations, i.e. try to change the story. So now they say they're going after Susan Rice today. Mm-hmm. They're trying to take our attention away from the Russians. You are an information warfare expert. How do you read this?
I think on the latter part, I think one of the things that's so unnerving for anybody who has worked on Russia for so long when you're looking at the Trump team is the similarity of tactics that they use to engage the media, to engage the public. And this is very much the deny, deflect, divert that you see the Russians having mastered as a way of interacting with the media in the last decade. Where you never really answer a question. When you do, you sort of pivot to what you want to talk about, and the answer is always that it's somebody else's fault and there's someone worse than you in the world. Jill very well summed up this sort of architecture of moral equivalency that the Russians really love. And it's, yeah, okay, Russia's not great, but everybody else is just as bad. And I think that's one of the things that's the hardest for Americans to accept about the new style of information warfare from the Russian Federation. It's not how it was in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, where there was sort of one line of effort to say, our system is better than the West, our system is this, our system does that. It's not that anymore. There's many narratives that they're promoting, and all of them are about making us question ourselves and our system and the things that we believe in and the values that we know are right and good in the world. And they're getting very successful at it. And I think until we understand that it's not that they want to promote one alternate truth, but make us question our own truth and all truth, that we are still way at the beginning of understanding how they operate and what they're doing. And so I think that sort of overlap of information style and tactics that you see between the Trump team and between some of the Russian spokespeople is unnerving to many of us because it embraces something that we view as very insidious. I think on the election question, Jill couldn't have sort of started this discussion better. To me, this is such a failure of the entire American elite, because this was not about politics. This was not about Clinton or Trump or anyone else. This was an attack on American society by our greatest adversary in the world. We did not define them as this, they defined us as this. The Russian doctrine defines the United States of America as their main opponent and their main enemy in the world. It's very clear, there's no question about this. And the types of tactics that they were using in this election, it was not just fake news and hacks and leaks. That's a very minimal understanding of what was happening. It was the construction of a very sophisticated information architecture that is all about subversion and disruption and upheaval in our society. It's not about convincing you of some truth. It's about you not understanding where that idea even came from. And I think you see how the Russians have been operating. For the US, this is so hard because it's one data point, and people who haven't paid attention to Russia and don't really care about that part of the world, you see our election and what happened, and it looks so confusing and improbable. But if you put it in the context of what the Russians have been doing in their own region and further abroad, since at least 2007, but the Georgian War, the Georgian elections in 2012, the sort of takeover of Moldova by oligarchs, the constant attacks on politics in the Baltic states, the promotion of far-right parties and far-left parties across Europe, the types of information architecture that they've been using, and other active measures as well. The things that happened in the US were no different than anywhere else. And I just remember sort of waking up the day after the election and having the same feeling I had the day after the election in 2012 in Georgia when the Russian oligarch sort of took over the country, of feeling that I'd spent years working in small countries trying to protect them from Russian aggression and Russian influence, and I should have been here, working here, and the fact that we missed it. And again, our entire elite missed it. They knew what the Russians were doing. Intelligence, people on the Hill, people in the White House, people in the administration, people in the media, everyone that we count on to protect us from attack said nothing. And that's something we really need to dig into, because it's a complicated question, but it's why especially students have a big role to play in what comes next and the direction of our country. Sorry for such a long answer.
No, well said. Thank you very much. Thank you. Kevin, you've heard Jill, Molly, you've got a lot of experience with the Russians. How do you read this?
So if somebody is waiting for me to then present the counter view to this, you're not going to get a counter view from me. I largely agree with what's been said about the seriousness of the Russian attack on the election, on the hacking in DNC, and so on. And I think Jill covered it very well with the historical perspective. One of her jobs, which you didn't mention, I know it's hard to mention all the jobs that Jill did, but she worked for Voice of America, if I can remember right.
Oh, my first job.
Yeah, and so she's been out there on the front lines combating fake news from the Soviet Union and onward for many years. She understands that very well. I think she was very eloquent in talking about that. I guess if I was to try and add anything to this, I would say, first of all, that as bad as all of this is, I don't think that I agree with the comments by people who say it's an act of war. I don't see it as an act of war. As a military man, I don't think it would be right for a president for Obama to have said in October, we're going to war with Russia. So I don't see this as an act of war. In fact, President Obama and his team knew 90% of what we know now. They knew it then and chose not to do anything.
Divulge it during the election.
So what that means to me is that as serious and as horrible a problem as this is, they did not think it was affecting the election or was going to swing the election one way or the other. And they didn't see it certainly as an act of war, or even, he waited a long time to do anything. He thought more about the American electoral process, that it was sturdy enough to weather this, and that if he threw a wrench in it now, that he would do more damage than the Russians were doing. So that should give us some idea of where this is on the spectrum of damage to America. The last thing I'll say, and I'm not an apologist for Russia on this, they're certainly at fault for this, but some of the blame for the chaos that we're experiencing right now belongs to us. So Russia has stirred the pot, and we're off to the races. So we're very happy to blame each other different sides of the aisle for what's going on and to whip up our own storm out of this, which I think has already been mentioned that in a way we're being agitated into this thing, and I think that's a success for Russia. And so we have some control over this. We certainly can rein this back in if we choose to.
So one of the more difficult challenges ahead of us is the fact that we know now, because he said it, that the FBI Director James Comey said that he is investigating possible collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. We have to be careful with this, possible collusion. I've not seen any evidence, and really experienced people like Mike Morrell and James Clapper have said they have not yet seen evidence that would constitute collusion by members of the Trump campaign with the Russian government. But that's a charge. It's being investigated by the FBI. There's a lot of smoke. We haven't seen the fire yet. Jill, what do you make of this? Do you think it's going to be pursued? Do you think we'll ever actually know? Will this investigation ever get to an endpoint?
I think it's going to be very difficult because a lot of this, when you get into those areas, some of it is sources and methods that cannot be revealed. That's part of it. And other parts of it, I think, are so complex that it may be very difficult to really, come to a fine point on it and say, yes, they definitely did. I would hope that we do. I think it's very, very important. But, so much of this entire world of the narrative, et cetera, is very diffused and it's very confusing. And so to find something that you can actually write down in black and white and say it's true gets even more difficult. And then add to that this political situation. And I think, General Ryan is totally correct when he says part of it is our responsibility. Americans don't really, they've taken positions in their own camps right now without realizing the broader picture of what is going on. And so it pains me sometimes to go outside of the country and look back at all of this and see the internal divisions. So if we get some facts, even if we get real facts, I think they will be misinterpreted, overinterpreted, underinterpreted, shaded, and changed. So good luck.
Thank you for that very hopeful comment. So they say the cover-up's worse than the crime. We don't know if a crime has been committed. Collusion, active aiding and abetting a foreign country involved in our election hasn't been proven yet. But the Trump administration is not cooperating. They clearly don't want to cooperate with the Senate and House Intelligence Committees. They're, as David Ignatius says, admit nothing, deny everything, make counter-accusations. We've seen a series of counter-accusations designed to cast our direction off to the side of the room while the central issue goes unattended. Right, wrong? I mean, is this the right strategy for President Trump? Wouldn't it be better just to say, I'm opening up the vault, talk to anybody in my administration, anybody in my campaign, I'll fully cooperate, I'll investigate, I'll help you investigate. He's not saying that. He's denying that anything happened. Is that credible to you?
I think it's hard. I think it is part of the continuity of everything that has been Trump and will always be Trump. I don't think we should expect any change or adaptation from Trump the TV personality to Trump the president. It's clear that this is the Trump that there is. And I don't think that that is part of his modus operandi in anything. I think that the more they hide and divert questions on these issues, the harder it becomes for them to say they didn't know anything. Because again, I wrote this long piece in January that I would encourage all of you to read. It's in Politico magazine. It's called Putin's Real Long Game. It sort of goes through, in way too many words, the history of what I know about how Russia operates now in the world. But the purpose of that was really to say Russia is the greatest threat to our country, and regardless the outcome of the election, the American president now has to deal with it, and the American president is now Donald Trump. And Donald Trump actually does have tools in his arsenal in terms of his personality, in terms of his sort of bombastic nature and unpredictableness and everything else that would be a real advantage in dealing with a Russia that's very much on the front foot and very much on the attack. And really to focus his administration on that. This is a very important
So he has
thing
a
to
skill
counter.
set that might deal effectively with a guy
Absolutely.
like Putin.
Putin is used to being the most unpredictable sheriff in town, and now that's Donald Trump. And that is not something he is Putin is particularly excited about. I think there's real evidence to say the Russians didn't expect Trump to actually be able to win. Their whole narrative setup was this, America's corrupt elite around Clinton ensure that she won the election, there is no democracy, blah, blah, blah. And they were really quiet for a few days after the election, which generally indicates they were spending a lot of time thinking about what the new narrative was. They don't know what to make of Trump yet. They don't know what to do with him. Trump can use that if he chooses to. The problem for all of us Russia nerds has so far been that it is the one issue where he has not reconsidered his position, where he has never pivoted, where he has never accepted new information. And that makes no sense when it is actually what all of our military leaders, what all of our intelligence leaders, and many of our experts say is the greatest threat to our country. And this is the one place where he's sort of making constant entreaties about new relationships. So I think all of that sort of wrapped together, the no policy on anything, particularly on Russia, no mentions of Russia, no mentions of the attacks, puts the Trump administration in an awkward position that they could get out of if they wanted to, but they seem to not want to.
Thank you. Kevin, this leads to a policy question about the U.S.-Russia relationship. President Trump had been musing publicly during the campaign, and in the first weeks of his presidency, Putin and I on the stage, I admire him, he's a strong leader, we can get along. Why shouldn't we have a good relationship? Maybe I'll end the sanctions over Ukraine. We can work together against the Islamic State. What's the big deal about Crimea? Isn't President Trump boxed in now by the FBI investigation, by John McCain, Lindsey Graham, Mitch McConnell saying, no, we've got to keep the sanctions on, be tough? Does he have much running room?
I run a group called the Elba Group. That's a great setup. We didn't agree to do this before.
It's good, though.
But the Elba Group is retired U.S. and Russian generals from the military and intelligence services. We meet every year. We've been meeting since 2010. Since Crimea, we've become one of the only mill-to-mill and intelligence channels out
You're all
there.
former retired.
All former, all retired,
Yep.
not still in the government, but we still report back up into our governments. And when we met in Malta back in March, the Russians asked almost the exact same question. They said, we know, the first thing they said when they shook our hand and said, great to meet you for this next meeting, we know that President Trump's hands are tied by the domestic situation. What we want to know is, have his views changed? I think that's what everybody sitting in the room wants to know. And we didn't really know how to answer that. Of course, we said, we probably think that Trump is still, dedicated to his campaign views and to his things he said as a president. So I think Trump President Trump is dedicated to the idea that we have to change the dynamic with Russia. I think that's a good thing because it gets us out of a box that we were in with President Obama, where we couldn't talk to Russia. If you can't talk, then you can't even begin the process of weeding through these problems. So that was a good thing. And the only question is now, is he savvy enough? Has he got the right people around him to use that to leverage Russia and to begin to resolve some of these very serious problems that cause us to call Russia an adversary, maybe our biggest adversary. Ukraine, Crimea, these underlying problems, Syria, and so on. So I think that Trump has a nugget there that he can use if he knows how to use it. But his hands are tied domestically right now. That's absolutely right.
Thank you. Well, let me ask the three of you some policy questions before we get to your questions. And if you agree with the idea that the Trump administration is badly divided between a radical right movement led by people like Steve Bannon, who want to turn conventional policy upside down, and a more establishment conservative group, Rex Tillerson, James Mattis, H.R. McMaster, and there's a struggle for the future of the administration between these two factions. Let's ask some questions. Jill, will the United States maintain the economic sanctions on Russia that Chancellor Merkel desperately wants us to maintain on Ukraine? Will President Trump change that policy, or will he keep the sanctions?
I think at this point they're going to keep them. For how long, I don't know, but I think it would be very, very an amazing step right now if they were to eliminate him. Perhaps when he came into office, perhaps that was a dream that he had. But I don't think at this point, you know, politically you could really do it. And now, with the comments coming out of the administration, albeit sometimes internally contradictory comments about Syria and Russia's culpability and Russia's responsibility, I think it's going to be very hard for them to get rid of those sanctions. I think the sign today of having Steve Bannon out of the NSC is good, at least in my viewpoint, because now we have the adults are in there, the normal people are in there, and they can make some decisions. And I think they could be educating the president, really, in the subtleties and the complexities of these issues. It sounded so good just to say, wouldn't it be nice if we could deal with Russia? That's not a policy. And now all the very difficult realities are on display, especially today.
Thank you. And Kevin, I think the companion question to the one I just asked Jill is, as Putin has invaded and probed the territorial integrity of all of his neighbors south and west of the Russian Federation, all of them, NATO has moved battalions of troops into Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia where Molly lives, Poland. There's been a big American military buildup in Europe, not to fight but to deter and contain. Will that continue, or will Trump water that down? What do you think?
I think that one thing that both President Trump and President Putin have indicated, one of the things that the Russian military officers told us this past March was that they want a summit as soon as possible, and that the focus of the summit should be defeating ISIS in Syria. Now, they got this information from General Gerasimov and from Minister Lavrov, so you know it didn't come just from them, it came from above them. And so if there is a summit, I think that Donald Trump, the man of the deal, is willing to put a lot of things on the table, including sanctions and possibly some of the things you mentioned. I think it's very difficult for him to roll back the military deployments because they're tied into NATO, a place you know much better than I do. You know how difficult it would be to turn that ship around on a dime. So I think the answer to your question is that he probably will not change the deployments and the buildup that's happened there. If I were advising him, I would tell him not to do that. Don't change those things. Keep that as your strong hand and work on Russia in other ways. So you and I both spent time fighting the Soviet Union. You know, I spent half of my 30-year career fighting the Soviet Union, the last half trying to cooperate with it. So it's maybe not unusual for you to hear from me and to other people that there's a duality of the relationship with Russia. There are things that we need to be strong against, and there are things that we need Russia to help us with in order to get them done. And you have to try to balance those things together.
Thank you. Molly, both Russia, the Russian Federation, and the United States have been victims of terrorism, specifically Islamic terrorist groups in the North Caucasus, Russia, weaved from Al-Qaeda. There was a terrorist attack in St. Petersburg 2 days ago. President Putin wants President Trump to be a partner and together to oppose that type of terrorism. You wrote about this 2 days ago. Should we take that deal? Is he our partner on terrorism or not?
So I think maybe to pivot a little bit to the last two answers as well, it's absolutely true that we need to have an open bilateral relationship with Russia and look for ways to communicate. We also need to be able to hold them to account for the things that they actually do and the things that they actually say. And we're very bad at doing that right now, at looking at what they actually say and what their actions are and interpreting what our own position should be. Of course, we want a better relationship with a cooperative Russia that is interested in an international rules-based system, but they're not. And they continually say this openly, and they don't want that relationship with us from everything that we can see in terms of their actions, not their press statements and not their propaganda, but in terms of what they actually do and how they act. And I think the problem of this, it's funny to hear people say, things got so bad in the Obama administration, because of course at the beginning of the Obama administration, you had the reset. And the beginning of the Bush, George W. Bush administration, you had sort of a reset. And it's this same cycle. Everybody comes in and they get the binder and they're flipping through the binder and they go, oh, well, this is obvious. If only the Russians understood that it's in their interest to cooperate with the West, to integrate into the West, which is a wealthier, more stable, more prosperous society, then everything would be fine. And they all sort of run off to Moscow and have the first meeting and say, guys, if only you were going to be part of the West, everything would be better for you. And they're looking at you and they nod and they're just like, mm-hmm. But they've never changed how they view that. And that is something we need to accept. They are not trying to become us. They do not view us as stronger than them. They are trying to weaken our system until we are at the same level as how they view themselves. And that is something that is so counterintuitive to American diplomatic logic, to American military logic, to how we see the world and how we operate in a very optimistic, naive, and sometimes very cynical way. But the combination of those three things is our country. And until we are willing to see the Russians for what we are, we're really at a disadvantage. And I think on terrorism, it's a trap. And I know you probably have a lot to add on this. No. On terrorism, I think that it's absolutely been the trap. They continually tried delay for the Obama administration as they escalated the military campaign in Syria, as they destabilized the region, as they made the situation far worse, as they materially supported ISIS in a number of ways, as did Assad. And then captured Hezbollah and the Iranian Al-Quds Force and other terrorist groups as their paramilitary forces for their ground army in Syria and in Iraq. So this idea that Russia is fighting terror, okay, maybe internally they killed a whole lot of Chechens and now there's like this weird new Kadyrov land that is New Chechnya. But externally, Russia does not fight terrorism. They just don't want it in their own country. And they are using terrorism and empowering terrorism and using it as sort of military force around the world because they view it as another tool of disruption. And they know that this is a place where they can keep coming to us and saying, we have information, we have intelligence, we should all share things, we should all work together. And that would be great, except they're not trying to fight terrorism in the Middle East. They are supporting materially multiple terrorist organizations in the Middle East.
So Jill and Kevin, the follow-up question I'd ask both of you based on what Molly just said is that when the White House and State Department reacted yesterday to the Syrian chemical weapons attacks on civilians, President Trump essentially said he holds President Assad responsible and he holds President Obama responsible and was very critical in writing of President Obama, but Secretary Tillerson said the people we should hold responsible in addition to the Syrian government are Russia and Iran, complicit. So there was a very different explanation from the White House and State Department of what happened. Is Russia complicit? And should we not think of Russia as our partner against terrorism, given what just happened in Syria?
Well, I think Russia is complicit in the sense that it is supporting, and that was the whole purpose of its military operation, it is supporting the Assad regime, there's no question. And they are responsible for the agreement. They're the ones who dreamed up the agreement to get rid of Syrian weapons, chemical weapons. So yes, I think in that sense they are culpable. And today they're denying that even that it was a chemical attack carried out by the Assad government. They have another explanation, which we don't have to go into, but they're denying it. And they reiterated their support for the Assad regime. So I think if, let's say, we hope there's an investigation, but right now it does appear that the government, the Syrian government, carried this out. Therefore, Russia is complicit. But I just wanted to get to one thing that Kevin was mentioning, and I think this is really important. When we look at Russia, there's a high level of emotionalism right now. I mean, we don't have the tools, we don't have the words to think about Russia in a different way other than the Soviet Union. And so it's, the emotional content of the Soviet Union was very, very high. And so Putin is, quote, a monster, quote, a killer, etc. I think we have to get rid of a lot of this inflated rhetoric, this emotional rhetoric, and do something more like what Molly's talking about, which is listen to what President Putin is saying, watch objectively what Russia is doing, and react, the United States, in a very adult way to that. And we're not doing it. And this whole debate, for good or for ill, is turning it into another kind of emotional, crazy, cinematic relationship, which we don't need.
Thank you. Kevin?
So I would just, I think both comments very good, very expansive. I would say that all the things that Molly said are a very good description of the frustrating aspects of dealing with Russia. However, at the end of the day, if you lay that all out, you still have the task of doing something.
Absolutely.
So my point in looking at that and saying, what do we want to do? What can we do? What should we do? That question still remains, no matter who and how long that list becomes. During the Cold War, the Russians shot down U.S. aircraft along the Russian border 39 times. 39 times they killed American pilots and damaged aircraft.
We kept talking
shot
to
them down, right. So, and yet we kept talking. We did things. So this is a horrible thing that's going on in Syria. It's horrible. But if we'd been talking to Russia a year and a half ago, if we had done things differently in some ways, maybe we wouldn't be at this point today in Syria. So we need to start some time, and I think now's the time to start.
So this may be an opportunity for President Trump to establish that channel.
I think that's the one thing he's giving us with regard to Russia. We can all agree that Russia is not your favorite dance date at the dance, and that we would rather do other things and work with other countries. But Russia is a player in Syria. Russia and Syria, the Syrian government, they can help us solve the problem in Syria. They can also prevent us from imposing our own solution. So that sounds to me like a situation where you need to compromise with Russia.
One more quick question, then we're going to go to your questions. But here's the wrap-up question of this conversation. Would it be reasonable to say that in part because of what's happened in Eastern Europe with Putin's aggression, we have to hold the line and contain Putin in Eastern Europe until Putinism is no more, until Putin's no longer president and his system has passed from the scene. But at the same time, as we're containing in Europe, there is an agenda that all of you have identified. We have to talk to him about North Korea, Iran, Afghanistan, counter narcotics. There's an agenda there. So we'll be slightly cooperative, but we'll be containing Putin, not back in the Cold War, but massing American military power against him to prevent any further damage in the Baltic states. Is that a reasonable way to describe what President Trump and his successor should be doing? Jill?
Well, I think that they should keep troops, at least rotational troops, in the Baltics and Central Eastern Europe. If you started pulling them out, as Kevin pointed out, it's very bad for the NATO alliance, so I would keep them there. But your idea of waiting Putinism out, I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, Putinism is a much broader idea, a much broader concept that a lot of Russians actually support. Maybe not Putin per se, but the idea that Russia is back on the stage, that Russia can accomplish things, that Russia matters, that Russia is important in Syria, etc. Now, the counter-narrative in the United States is he's a spoiler. You know, he goes in sometimes deliberately to create a problem, which then he can, quote, solve. But I do think that that pride in Russia, the feeling that Russia is back and it matters, goes way beyond Putin. And so if we just kind of concentrate on, you know, waiting and he's going to go and somebody else will come in, it will be a big mistake. I think we have to rationally, soberly evaluate him as a leader, understand why people do support him in Russia, and then try to deal with them. Kevin's totally right, we have to talk. I think number one is talking. This idea that you can punish Russia by stopping talking is crazy, and it did not work. So that would be number one, begin to talk.
So, Molly, is Jill right that Putinism outlasts Putin?
I think the thing that is sort of terrifying to understand about modern Russia is the accepting of the Russian exceptionalist narrative that Putin represents. This idea that, you know, when we talk about American exceptionalism, you can define it however you want, but you sort of understand it as this sort of, you know, happy, holistic concept. Russian exceptionalism is not American exceptionalism. It's this idea that Russia can only be great when it is distinct and apart from the world because it represents a distinct, unique historical trajectory that is different from everyone else. And Russians have accepted this. They like the projection of power. They believe Russia should be a significant international player. You see it even in, you know, sort of the people that we view as the maybe next things in Russia, Navalny and Khodorkovsky and others. They all say the same thing because they know they're never winning an election in Russia if you do not embrace the same ideas. So I think Jill is absolutely right that this is not something that's going away anytime soon, and we need to find a way to talk to it and deal with it in a very clear-eyed manner by, again, seeing what Russia does, listening to what they say, and evaluating our own options against that in different ways. And a piece of it is the military deployments. You know, there's been the long-term narrative from Russia has been, we have to do these things because you, the West, humiliated us in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Which, you know, you can poke holes in 1,000 different ways, but you know, was inviting Russia to the G8 when it has a tiny, tiny economy an insult? Was inviting Russia to have a partnership with NATO an insult? Was inviting Russia into the WTO and the OECD and other international institutions humiliating? Well, no, but apparently it was for them. And they love this narrative of, you have made us do these things. But if you look at the last decade of American force deployment in Europe, as we have pulled our tanks out, you know, our first 200 tanks are showing up back in Poland for the first time in however many years. But as we have pulled our forces out, the Russians have moved forward. So this idea that, you know, they were deploying against our forces is nonsense. When NATO sort of notionally announced, we're going to send these 4 new battalions, so that's less than 4,000 guys, and some artillery and some other equipment to the Baltic states and to Poland as forward deployed, sort of more than a tripwire, but deterrent measures. The Russians said, fine, we're sending 4 brigades, so that's 40,000 guys to the western border of Russia. This is how they think in this, you know, sort of, again, seeing what they actually do, not accepting their press releases at face value, and evaluating our options in a clear-eyed way against that, not trying to change what's there or explain away their sins for them, which we've gotten really good at doing, but approaching it in a realist way is extremely important.
So, a great question. I agree that Putinism is not going away. Putinism is evolving, actually, and it's changing into something that's far different than what it started as. And I think it's becoming more and more nationalism. We've had Russian speakers come here, not my idea, but their insight, and tell us, you don't want to deal with the person who comes after Putin. He will be worse. He will be one of these nationalistic fighters who fought in the Ukraine or Crimea or something, and now what he wants to do is have a great, you know, Russian empire again. So that's number one. If I was telling President Trump what to do now, I would say this is your moment. Putin is coming up to an election. You have laid the groundwork that you have already leveraged Russia. Russia did not kick out US diplomats when we kicked out theirs. You've already got some power over him. If you play this correctly, you can get some concessions. This is your moment. And Mr. President, you should do one thing. That is, you should you should do what's best for U.S. interest. So if it's best for U.S. interest to have strong NATO defense, which it is, then you should do that. Yeah. At the same time, you should be cooperating against ISIS. If it's best for us to cooperate on WMD, non-proliferation, and combating nuclear terrorism, you should do that. If it's at the same time, you should be countering Russian cyber attacks. If it's best for us to modernize our nuclear weapons, you should do that at the same time that you are talking about arms control possibilities. So these things are just two different aspects of the one thing we need to focus on. What is best for the United States?
America first, as Donald Trump would say.
America first, America great. I don't want to say that because I think that that's too loaded. But I do think a reevaluation of what are our interests and to go at those.
Thanks to Kevin and to Molly and to Jill. Fascinating, 3 experts. Now to you. So we have a microphone here, microphone there, 2 in the balcony. You're first, because you lined up first. And just name, rank, serial number, question.
Does this work? Yes.
It works. You're on air.
My name is Jim Pinney. I'm a financial planner and investor in Cambridge. I live in Cambridge. I'm very familiar with how fond people are of their money. And I saw on one of these innumerable TV shows that I was watching this guy who said that it's really simple, which is that Putin owns Trump. If you look at his financing, he went bankrupt. Nobody would lend him any money. He borrowed money from Russian banks to build a lot of his projects.
Who are you talking about?
Putin. I mean Trump. Trump borrowed money from Putin, from Russia, a lot of it. If Russia calls it in, he's bankrupt. So why wouldn't that be enough? We wouldn't need any other secret meetings or anything like that. Trump knows this threat. Why wouldn't that be enough to just explain it? And we wouldn't have to demand anything other than his tax returns. There is a reason why he hasn't released them. And
okay.
If he's owned by the Russians, that's not a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I just feel compelled to say, in the interest of fairness, that these are allegations. A lot of people believe them to be true, but they haven't been substantiated. Molly.
And maybe I'll take that one. I would just say a lot of stuff is coming out every minute about this, that, the other thing, especially on the financial part. It is extremely hard to document when things are very opaque. It's all offshores, bags of money moving this way and that way. But I think, the perspective that is important in all of this to sort of get out of the salacious day-to-day discussions of the Trump administration and its ties to Russia is looking at what Russia actually does. And Putin's Russia has spent 15 years longer bankrupting the country, if you look at actual balance sheets, to export Russia's wealth, which is stolen basically from the Russian people. To export Russia's wealth to buy the West. And you can define that in a number of ways, but it is, the movement of money into the West, it is the purchase of real estate, it is the investment in our companies, it is the, long lines of effort to cultivate relationships with cultural and political and other elite. But the movement of Russian money outside of Russia is not just to move wealth, to buy yachts and other things. It is for purpose. It is a part of the tools of sort of the Russian security state's interaction with the world. And it has very much been deliberate and on purpose to build and cultivate relationships with not just American billionaires, but billionaires everywhere. And you can't, there's no way to look at any of this stuff and say, well, that guy, from 1983, they thought this guy was going to be the next thing, and they've been, cultivating financial relationships with him. But if you look at the pattern of how Russia works in the region, if you look at Georgia, if you look at Moldova, if you look at the Baltics, if you look other places, there are billionaires or sort of local oligarchs that have significant financial ties to Russia, that they have leveraged into politics when these individuals have decided to go into politics themselves, that they have used to cultivate people who have soft views on Russia. And this is the new thing. It's no longer, it's not really the Marine Le Pen types. It's not really the, pro-Russian far-right nutters that the Russians value. It's this soft on Russia group where they sort of pretend to be pro-European and pro-Western and whatever, but underneath they have different relationships to Russia. But I think understanding, again, how Russia has worked in the region and how they use their money for these purposes is important in how we evaluate what we are seeing in the United States. Because it is not a standalone data point. It is a part of a broader spectrum of effort.
And then there's this allegation in the United States, Jill, in France. We know that Marine Le Pen has taken loans from Russian state banks. She was in Moscow meeting with Putin in the Kremlin last week. Extraordinary for a French presidential candidate to do that. What are we seeing?
It's true. I mean, I think Molly began this, and I think it is correct. There's no doubt that Russia uses money as a tool. You could almost call it militarized money. You know, they use it for a variety of purposes. Corruption is a gigantic problem in that entire region, and that also becomes a way of corrupting political leaders, etc. I am not going to get into Donald Trump because I just don't think that that is proven, and it's easy to talk about. But in general, we do know that Russia uses corruption and money for political influence all over the world. It's not too much to say that it's not happening in the United States. But you know, a lot of this, I am not totally convinced that Putin sits there and says, let it happen, and then it magically happens. And he is not the most powerful man in the world. In fact, one of the reasons they use some of these tools is because they are not militarily up to any type of competition with NATO. This is their strong suit only because they are not militarily able to really beat NATO. So we have to get realistic about some of this as well.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yes, it is.
Okay, yes. My name is Martti Vallila is the Finnish pronunciation of my name. Marty Vallila is the American pronunciation. My father was from Finland. I immigrated to the US when I was 7 years old. I traveled first to Russia in '91, and I've formed companies on behalf of Russian inventors, and I've written some books, one of which is Banana in Russia, which it's on Amazon and Kindle. And so now I want to segue into some comments here. Jill, you asked, I think it's very important for America and Russia to talk, but the question is, what should they be talking about? And I would propose that the thing they should be talking about is what I address here is intellectual property. In other words, one of the things that's most of you are probably, certainly the students here are too young to remember back in '91, '92, there was a Russian spring. There was a lot of enthusiasm about Russia when the Soviet Union collapsed, and that's when I started traveling there. And one of the fundamental ideas is Russians have wonderful ideas, but they don't produce anything for the world because they're coming from an alternate society. And the question for Russia is, do you want to keep being a bad boy, or do you want to be a good boy, become a member of the civilized world? And so that's what got me into forming companies.
And your question,
My
sir.
question, okay. The skill set, Molly made a point about what is Trump's skill set? Does Trump have a skill set that's applicable today? I would argue that the key issue today is communication and communicating directly with the population, something that Trump has demonstrated an ability to do.
So your question is whether Donald Trump has a skill set that might be conducive to negotiating with Putin?
No, not negotiating with Putin, talking directly to the Russian people.
Okay.
Where he is popular. He is very popular in Russia.
Thank you
so that's
very
what I
much.
would like to ask. What are the implications of this?
Thank you. Great. Molly.
It's an interesting question, and I think again, it's this sort of odd nervousness you see from Sheriff Putin that the popularity of Trump is something there that he is also nervous about, and I think for this reason, that it means there's a new voice that the Russians are looking at and listening to, and there was some really good documentation by some of the Russian media watchers of right after the election there was like Trumpomania in Russian state media. And then there was sort of a memo that went out because for the first time since 2011, Trump was the most mentioned thing in the Russian news instead of Putin. So it was the first time for years that the first thing in the news was Trump and was not Putin, but something else. And so they sort of sent out this memo that was like, tone it down, guys. And so it has been pulled down a bit. But I think there is this nervousness. Can he be an alternate something for the Russian public? But this is always the discussion. How do you speak to the Russian public effectively as an outside anything when the media environment is so controlled within the Russian Federation? In Russian, certainly, the entire Russian language space is dominated by Kremlin media, but in English as well, because certainly enough Russians speak English to get information from outside. I think, when you look at Russian society, we tend to look at Russia as the thing, the former Soviet thing, so the military and the diplomatic structures and the businesses and everything else. But if you look at Russian society, there's a lot of problems. Just look at some of the numbers. 55% of the economy is state-owned. So 28% of the workforce, plus another 1% that's the security state, is directly employed by the state. 40 Russian women are beaten to death by their domestic partners every day. And the Russian government just decriminalized domestic violence because it was too much of a problem to deal with. Imagine that. In the US, that would mean 90 women die every day from domestic violence. So 2 per state. If you were in Massachusetts and 50 women were beaten to death by their husbands or partners every month, wouldn't you expect your government to do something about it in Russia? Not a crime. 35 Russians die every day from alcohol poisoning, not from drinking too much, but from drinking stuff like antifreeze because they can't get a fix off of anything else. This is not to say that other countries don't have problems at all. It's just that there are deep systemic problems in Russia that come from coming out of the Soviet Union, never really having dealt with the legacy of that history, and this institutionalization of violence that has really happened in the last 20 years in Russia that is very hard to overcome. If Putin were to disappear tomorrow and there were someone to emerge that were not Putin-like to rule the country, I would actually argue that Russian society has a harder wake-up now than they did in 1991 in terms of the difference between what they think they are in the world and what they actually are in the world. That is very difficult for us to deal with because it's people. It's not a weird militarized society. It's just another country where people want to live well, have good lives for their children. Finding a way to communicate with Russian society that is not controlled by the Kremlin is very important.
Thank you very much, Molly. Let's go right here for this question.
Hello. Oh,
You're
there
on.
it is.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Malia Paul. I'm originally from Seattle, and I went to the University of Washington, but I live here now, and I work in Cambridge. And my question is on the topic of talking to Russia and engaging in a dialogue with them. It seems that both governments are a little wary of each other right now and uncertain as to how they should deal with one another. What is the state of track 2 diplomacy, or what potential is there for sort of these more informal, non-governmental actors to be productive?
Thank you very much. So track 2 diplomacy, when governments can't communicate effectively, maybe citizens can. Kevin runs a track 2, I would think you run ELBA. Track 2.
Run the ELBA group. I'll give you a short answer, but then because you're from Washington, I have to give the floor to Jill. I know she's aching to talk to a fellow Washingtonian.
Especially after Gonzaga's defeat the other day.
So yes, there is a big role for track 2, absolutely. And it's difficult to get a track 2 going in the same way that it's difficult to get the 2 governments together, but it's easier than getting the 2 governments together. So that's very important. And I would say that in terms of what they can do is they can represent policy options that the government really is not in a position to represent. And I think you understand the track 2 idea, so you can understand how floating ideas that might not be possible to float from a government official is a good thing. And Jill, I don't know if you...
Well, I would just jump in and say, I'm with another track 2 organization, which is the Dartmouth Group, which in fact just met in Virginia. It's been around for 55 years, and it uses former diplomats on both sides, and other people, military diplomats, et cetera, who get together and discuss what the 2 countries can do to work together. It was founded right at the beginning, the height, I should say, of the Cold War, at a time that was very, very dangerous. So that continues. I think one of the problems right now with the Track 2 or other organizations is NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are being repressed, many of them in Russia, because they are considered agents from the outside, foreign agents. And so they've had to register. And this is a problem that makes it more difficult for NGOs just to get together to talk. In fact, Russia has cut back on some educational exchange, et cetera. I think the most important thing is for citizens to talk and to get together and to realize that these are two countries that have dealt with each other under crazy circumstances, dangerous, even more dangerous than this, I think, previously. And it worked out. We're still here. So that would be my pitch: more, let's say, Track 2 and more citizen diplomacy. Very important.
Thank you to both of you. I'd also say, and I'll turn to you in just a minute, that part of the problem with President Obama and President Putin is that their personal relationship fell apart. They couldn't even meet and talk. And I must say, looking back at President Obama, and I respected him greatly, but he was very dismissive of Putin publicly. You remember he said about Putin, he's like that kid in the back of the classroom slouching. This was a blow to Putin's self-respect. In diplomacy, you normally don't do that. And I wonder if President Trump has a chance, a positive opportunity, to try to meet Putin halfway, show some mutual respect. That's what you should do in diplomacy and state-to-state relations. So I'm just trying to think of something good I can say about President Trump. I've just said it, and may he take that opportunity. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Professor Burns. My name is Grant Rafter. I'm a student
Grant,
here.
Didn't
Yes,
see you.
if you can't see me in the light,
Right.
in Professor Burns' class. And
Yeah.
we've talked a lot in the past few weeks about what Trump should do when he negotiates with Putin, if that is to come this summer, when it does occur. And we've had lots of great advice of how he should handle himself. If Trump decides not to take that advice, or if he's not as great of a negotiator as he says he is, what is the best that Russia can get for the Donbass, in Crimea, looking at Syria? If the farm is given away, how much of the farm can be given away, given the resistance domestically from Senators McCain and others?
Great question from Grant. And I think, Grant, you're talking about, do we implicitly recognize the annexation of Crimea? Do we lift the sanctions and let Russia get away with the theft and division of Ukraine? Mikolas knows a lot about this, another student here. You might want to chime in a minute, Kevin.
I think that's a great point, that the founding fathers set up a system with divided responsibilities and authorities, and those other, the Congress, the legislature has got a role to play, and it's not clear that they would support all the giveaways that you imply that might happen in a worst case scenario from the U.S. perspective. So I think that's a great question. There's no way that I can answer it. Maybe somebody else knows the answer to that, but that's something to watch for.
I would say that the problem with, what does it look like if you give away the farm is we're actually already in a scenario where we've given away a lot of the farm. And the Russian annexation of Crimea, the invasion of eastern Ukraine, the long period of time when there was like this, is it Russia, is it somebody else, is it separatists, did they go buy Buk missiles at the shop and shoot down this airliner flying over Ukraine? Yeah, just like every time we play the game, Russia learned from their invasion of Georgia in 2008. They also learned that their military was a lot weaker than they thought, and they've totally revamped it into what it is now. But Russia learned in 2008 that the costs of actual military invasion and conquest in their own neighborhood are extremely high. Diplomatically, in terms of PR, otherwise, it's just not worth it. And they completely hardened Georgian society against any possible relationship with Russia anytime soon. So they've learned to do it these sort of sideways ways with, separatist groups. They're doing the same thing in the Middle East, but they're never going to do these direct invasions. They're always going to have these sort of other dudes standing out front. And I think it makes it very hard then to say, you know, what does it look like when you give away the farm? We've already allowed them to do all these things. We've already allowed them to set up the information architecture that is attacking our societies. We've already allowed them to have this space. And, you know, you can say whatever you want about President Bush, but the way that President Obama dealt with Russia was to leave a very open battlefield for them to advance into unchallenged, and however you want to define that. And they have, and they're sitting there, and they laugh every day about it, about how easy it has been to challenge our institutions and our values and the system that protects us. So I think we're already in a really weakened position, and it takes a very strong, clear-headed leader to go into a negotiation with Putin, to pull any of that back, to say, no more of this, we're redefining international law, we're making our own narrative, but these are the rules. You either play by the rules, or there are more serious consequences for you. It's not about maintaining the sanctions, which absolutely have to be maintained. It's about, you know, sort of going through the list of what are the next step options if Russia continues to act as it does in the world.
Thank you. So we have a challenge of variable geometry. We have 3 people who want to ask questions in 5 minutes. So let me suggest that we take them 1, 2, 3, and just ask your questions. We'll be very interested. And then I'd ask the panel, maybe one person can answer each of those questions, and you'll know which questions to answer. And we'll try to wrap up in 5 minutes. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. I also happen to be from Russia. So my question is that, I mean, in strong relationships, it takes 2 parties to build them, right? So what do you think were the mistakes of the US government in building stronger and better relationships in the past, let's say, 10 or 20 years?
Good question. So what were the mistakes of the United States government in the relationship? Mistakes in the relationship with Russia over the last 10 years. Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm a university professor. Came to MIT, then to Boston many times, and I'm Italian by birth. Okay, I'm a member of several academies, including the Russian Academy. I work as a nuclear physicist. I build bomb. And you are very distracted by what's happening today. Both Putin, but first I'm very sympathetic of what Obama did. Obama being the only thing he could do. He went as far to renegotiate the disarmament, bring it down in the first round of his term, 4 years, very low. Now the bombs are going to be increased. I was shocked by 2 things happened at the same time. At the same time, in Moscow, I'm a member of the academy, a professor here, professor there, professor everywhere. I'm Claudio Nicolini. You can go in the web. And I think.
Sir,
Professor Obama increase. Okay,
if
you don't let me make the point, then I think I stop. The point is the following.
I can't
There's a new budget.
We don't have time for you to make a speech, but you do have time to answer a question, to ask a question.
There's a new budget which increased tremendously the armament, the bomb, in the parliament. And this is happening at the same time in Russia and the United States. And Putin does not represent Russia. Russian people are completely disattracted by him. There was Boris Nemtsov was killed a year ago. So I think things are happening in Russia. He lost complete.
So, Professor, what is your question?
Obama was able to stop him. Now, I ask you, be careful if we're going to make bomb with a bottom. In one morning, the only one who has the atomic bomb are Russian and the United States, nobody else. And nobody's going to win the war. And we have a lot of problems with energy.
Is that your question?
This is my question.
Thank you.
You should stop here. And the first thing in the negotiations will be to disarmament, to continue disarmament, to complete the process begun by Nixon.
Thank you.
Okay? And you are losing everything else up.
Thank you very much.
Obama,
we appreciate your question. Yes, sir.
The panelists.
Thank you.
Your talks. I just want to make a quick point just before I ask a question, quicker than him. I was a bit disturbed earlier, Molly, when you said that Russia's inspired people to start asking questions about society, and you termed it as insidious, but your entire nation is founded on questioning the system. So I find that is not a bad thing, even if it comes from the inspiration is Russia. We should always be wanting to question, try and make the world a better place. And the concept about fake news versus real news, well, one of the best tactics that it seems in most mainstream media is to just not cover certain aspects of news as well. So I think, and so my question to you guys is, do you actually really think that the American system and society is working for everyone? And if not, should we redefine what we determine prosperity is? Because I think that was a major factor for both Trump and Brexit.
Okay, so let's do this. Jill, maybe you can take the first question. What were the mistakes made by the U.S.? And Kevin, Mr. Disarmament.
Sure, I get the war question.
Molly, are we imperfect? And should we be confident of the American model?
Yes.
Jill.
I'll talk fast. I think the biggest mistake was not understanding that the most important thing for people in any country is how you live. Do you have a good life? Do you have a job? Is your economy working? Can you put your kids in school? Can you trust the police? Can you get, can you go to the store and get goods? These are the things that are the most important. And I think when the United States, after the end of the Soviet Union, tried to deal with Russia, it dealt with it on very theoretical ideas, I hate to say, like democracy. You know, for many Russians, democracy was, I lost my job in the factory. My kids can't go to, summer school or vacation anymore. So we have to always, I think, focus on the real lives of people. And this is almost question 3, improving the lives of people. The desire for a better life is all over the world. And people, even in Russia, feel sometimes that the elites are deciding things for them. So number 1 would be the breadbasket issues, and that can be very helpful in dealing with Russia. Putin does have to respond to the demands of the Russian people for a better life. It got him into office, and it's something that is a factor right now in keeping him in power or not.
Thank you. Kevin.
So the Elba Group members are architects of wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Chechnya, Georgia. Some of them were wounded in those wars. They are more concerned about a war between the United States really than anything else. So they very much share your concern about the possibility of a war. General Kulikov told a joke at one of our meetings. He's the former ground commander for the first war in Chechnya. And he said the collective farm leader called all the workers together, and he said, "Comrades, for a long time now we have stood at the precipice, but today we take a step forward." And this is the problem with taking a step forward. You might step off the cliff. So the more people share your concern, thanks for bringing it up. Rest assured that many sober people are thinking about it.
Thank you, Kevin. Molly.
Does America suck worse than anywhere else?
Why don't you, let's do this, sir. Please come down and address, after we conclude, please come down and talk to us when we're finished. But don't try to hijack the whole meeting. Molly, please.
I certainly did not mean to imply that people should not ask questions of things. I think the reason that the American system works well and is the one that has gotten it the most right so far is that we do question and we do evaluate. And internally we have the ability to say, did we fight that war well? Are there things we're doing wrong? Are we addressing the needs of all of our citizens? Are we doing things differently? You can look at American history a lot of different ways. There's been a lot of up and down, but I think the truth is that has always been internal. That has always been internally driven. People see injustice, they see things that aren't working, and we find ways to address it because that's who we are as a country and a people, and it is why our system works so well and has worked so well for so long. And you can decry patriotism all you want, but the more time you spend in the world, I will say without question that the American system is the one that has so far gotten it the most right. And that's not to say it's perfect. There's a lot of things we need to fix, but we have to start from somewhere. And I think the basis of our system and our society is that we continually strive to address the things that we have not done well, and not to whitewash them or lie or obfuscate or start wars externally to ignore the fact that our economy is collapsing at home. We actually work internally to make our country better, because each one of us as American citizens and the residents that have moved here from other places believe that we're contributing to that society and to the fabric of that society, and that's why it works. So yes, everybody should question. I'm not in any way saying we shouldn't question what's happening or voice our own opinions, but that's a very different thing than what Russia is suggesting with its propaganda and with its disinformation. There's a lot going on in the world, and which is always a stupid thing to say because it sounds so simplistic, but there is this tremendous period of unraveling right now. The architecture that we have relied on since World War II for security and diplomacy and peace and prosperity is being challenged, and we either need to figure out what the next thing is and invest in that, or make what we have work better than what it has in the last few years. There are a lot of challenges to that, and the evolution of, this has all been sort of politics and war, but, the economy will change. If you're a big science nerd, then we can talk about robots and the mechanization of the economy and everything else. There are big changes coming for global society in terms of what work is and how we make money and prosperity and how everyone participates in society. But right now we're having, that's like a 22nd century conversation, and we're still having 20th century conversations about security with disruptors like Vladimir Putin, who keep us back in that level and who challenge us constantly with these, with sort of wars and upheaval and unrest. And it is not something that we should excuse or tolerate.
Thank you. I want to thank Jill Doherty, Molly McHugh, General Kevin Ryan. Thank you very much.